Lisa, here's an interesting exercise for you. Try to get together with a group of coworkers or friends and have a 10-minute conversation without using any gender-specific pronouns. It's a lot tougher than it might initially sound. This exercise is part of an employee training program from an LA-based group called Transgender. We'll hear more about some of the challenges and triumphs of transgendered Southern Californians. Stay tuned for that.
Thanks, Alex. Inside the Issues again comes up next at 8.
There are roughly 92,000 transgender adults living here in California. On this episode, we'll see how several of them are opening new doors at work, in sports, and in law enforcement. This is Inside the Issues. In 1980, Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari starred in a TV show called Bosom Buddies. They played two guys in need of a place to live in New York because their apartment building was going to be demolished. Their friend, Amy, convinces them to move into her building where the rent is incredibly cheap. The only hitch was it's women only. So the fellows decided to dress up like women and hilarity ensues. But that was then, and this is now. Shows today like Transparent, Orange is the New Black, and Pose depict a much more realistic and nuanced version of gender fluidity. The popularity of these shows help bring many issues faced by transgender people to light. But what is life like for real transgender people, especially those living here in Southern California? That's what we hope to explore here on Inside the Issues. And to start things off, we take a look at how gender transition can affect life in the workplace. And here to do that with us is Rex Wilde, Program Director at an LA-based organization called Transgender. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
I've heard countless stories of how transgender people can face discrimination and bullying in all sorts of realms. Let's hone in specifically on the workplace. What sort of issues can trans people face when they just are trying to earn their living, have a career?
Absolutely. Well, the issues with discrimination in the workplace are really so vast and varied. And so some of the things that I've seen in working with some of our clients, for example, was one client who went to use the restroom that was in alignment with her gender identity and actually had a customer complain about her using that restroom. And so her boss's response to that was actually to fire this woman from her job in order to make the customer more comfortable. We've also seen issues of things from anywhere from being uncomfortable to assault. One client that I was working with actually would go, he was a transgender man, would go and use the men's restroom, and two colleagues would consistently follow him in the restroom and harass him in the restroom in his workplace. And that's just two examples of how this issue looks in a variety of different ways in the workplace as well.
And so Transgender is doing any number of things. It's helping employers who want to be more inclusive hire trans people. It's helping trans people find jobs if they're looking to make a transition. How did all of this get its start? Because it started with this one business owner in particular who's got a fascinating story.
Yeah, absolutely. So our founder, Michaela Mendelson, actually is a restaurant owner in LA and is a transgender woman. And about 5 years ago, she started hiring transgender folks in her El Pollo Loco restaurants that she ran. And so through her work there, she actually started getting to hear some of the stories of transgender individuals and the experiences of discrimination and harassment they experienced in the workplace.
And so now you do these employee-based seminars. What are some of the most important points, do you think, to drive home when it comes to, hey, we've got someone who's transgender here in the workplace. We want to be accommodating of this person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people have to understand that they're going to need to do some learning around gender, their own understandings of gender, and also are going to need some really specific direction to make sure they're doing the right thing in the workplace. Through my seminars, I've learned that a lot of people want to be affirming, they want to do the right thing, but they just don't know how. And so we need to be able to give them the education and the tools to make sure they're moving forward and being affirming to everyone.
Yeah, and you talk about that confusing part of it. You're wearing right now, I don't know if viewers can see, you've got a button that says they/them.
Yes.
Explain.
And so they and them are actually the pronouns that I use. And so, for example, people use pronouns like he and him or she and her, whereas me and many folks who are considered non-binary or of third gender identities outside of men or women will use they and them as their pronouns.
Yeah. And so you actually have an exercise that people can do at work, and I would imagine at home as well, to kind of get more familiar with different language that they might not be familiar with. What should they do?
Absolutely. So I always tell people, spend 5 to 10 minutes a day by yourself practicing pronouns that you're not used to. Let's say you have someone in your workplace who goes by a different name instead of pronouns than you previously knew them by. Make sure to practice sentence with that person's name and pronouns by yourself or even with a colleague in a safe area so that you can get through the slip-ups, get through the mess-ups. Because the reality is, we're all human. We're going to mess up at some point. But if you can practice consistently, by the time you're talking to that person or about them while they're not around, you can make sure that you're doing it in the appropriate way.
Because it's really hard. We were talking about this earlier. My mom is an English teacher, and I was taught, because a lot of times when people are talking about he or she, and then the next jump to they, my mother always used to berate me, they does not refer to singular, it's plural, and I think that is how my brain is hardwired. So I'm sure if you and I were working together, at some point, I would botch it. What's the best way for people who want to be inclusive? What's the best way to kind of move past that? Or at least to acknowledge it without making people feel too bad.
Absolutely. So it's so interesting because with they and them pronouns, first off, we do use it in the singular all the time, but most people don't realize it.
Yeah.
If I left my phone and someone were to say, hey, who was the last person here? They left their phone here. We're only talking about one individual. So I think what it really starts with, though, is becoming conscious of the times where you need to use the appropriate pronouns if you're not. And so by bringing it to consciousness first off, but then if you are with an individual and you make a mistake, you're probably going to, and that's okay, but there's a best practice for how you can move forward. Mm-hmm. First off, apologize. And it doesn't need to be a big deal, just a quick, oh, I'm sorry. And then correct yourself. Use the correct pronoun, and then you can quickly move on in that conversation. And I would say that's the most respectful way that you can move forward when you do make mistakes. But the other thing is doing that practice so that it doesn't happen in the future.
Rex, we were lucky enough to meet you because you came here to Spectrum and did some trainings here. And I'd like to look at, you have a whole slide presentation that's great. And I would like to look at one slide in particular that I found was really interesting. Sex doesn't equal gender, doesn't equal sexuality. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for most of us, well, probably most people didn't ever have a point where someone sat them down to tell them what gender meant, right? I didn't have that experience. And so for most of us, we learn about sex based on a doctor's assignment. So a doctor, will look down at a person's genitalia when they're born and say either it's a boy or it's a girl.
Right.
And then based on that, we also end up assigning an expected gender. We have expected expectations for that person, pink for girls, blue for boys, and then comes this assumption of what that person's sexuality will be. And for most people, we assume that they are going to be heterosexual or that they're not going to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer in some type of a way. And so I like to use that slide to kind of bring this idea to light, since most of us learn that those things are going to be equivalent to each other or have a relationship. It's breaking down the idea that actually these things are very nuanced and have very specific definitions that don't necessarily have to do anything with each other.
Rex, I have a feeling that a lot of people might go into one of your workshops thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to be learning about some other employee because that person's going through a gender transition. Do you find that participants ever find out something about themselves through that process as well?
Absolutely. It's really amazing. Actually, in the past couple seminars that I've done over the past couple months, I've actually had 2 different individuals come to me, saying to me, one of them said, I identify as a woman, I was female assigned at birth, and I am straight, I'm not queer. But what I've realized through this is the way I want to express my gender, the clothes that I wear, actually is not in alignment with how I've been allowing myself to dress. I'm much more of a tomboy, and I want to dress more masculinely, but I thought because of how others expected me to be feminine, that's what I needed to do. And so I see folks all of the time learning more about the own diversity within their own selves, because I think, for so long we've had really traditional ideas of what gender expression and those expectations are, and really it's something that affects not only transgender people, but everyone in our society.
Rex Wilde, it is fascinating stuff, the work that you do with Trans Can Work. And we're going to have you back later on in the program with a special guest, so don't go too far away. And viewers, don't you go away either. Just ahead, transitioning from female to male while working as an LA County Sheriff. We'll hear one deputy's story coming up after this break. The LA Sheriff's Department is the largest sheriff's department in the world with roughly 18,000 employees. Turns out there are at least a dozen transgender sheriffs, and most of them made the change while on the job. For more on what that experience is like, we're joined now by Deputy Austin Guastalli. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you for allowing me to be here.
What was your initial desire to be part of law enforcement all about? Was that always what you thought you wanted to do with your life?
For the most part, that's what I wanted to do with my life. I tried a couple of different things, and I realized that law enforcement was really what I wanted to pursue. So I'm just blessed to have this opportunity.
Yeah. And you started off as a woman within the department. When did you start to think that maybe that was not exactly the gender that you wanted to stay with?
I think it's always kind of been there in the back of my head. What kind of brought it to the forefront was after a 4.5-year relationship, kind of took some soul searching. A few of my friends came out to me as transgender, and I started seeing some things in their story that kind of corresponded with my story. Yeah. And after thinking about it and praying about it, I realized that that was where I wanted to take my life. So.
Yeah, and that's a big decision to make, and I'm sure you're thinking about all sorts of things. Family, friends, all sorts of different situations. How much were you thinking about work, and how did you think people at work might respond to something like that?
You never know how people are going to respond to something like that. You hope for the best, but the way the Sheriff's Department with their transgender program that they have there, it's really a wonderful place to be able to have the opportunity to go from either one sex to the other sex within the department, because they allow for it without having any fallback from other coworkers saying maybe negative things about you, or not being able to go forward as far as maybe you want to become a sergeant or a lieutenant. None of those things come into play.
Yeah. I have to admit, I did not know that there was, in fact, and there is, this program within the Sheriff's Department, which I think might come as a surprise because law enforcement, we tend to think of as this very kind of macho culture. Can you talk a little bit about the program and what it was like for you to say to them, hey, I think I'm actually going to go through this transition, the range of responses that you got from your coworkers?
How I came out was I wrote an email, and I basically said, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to believe what I believe, but I would like you to respect me. And I'm a good partner. I do my job well. I'll be there to back you up. And if you could just take what I'm telling you as truth, as face value, and we can move forward from this, I'd really appreciate it. And for the most part, I've really had great feedback from partners. They respect me, and they accept me, and they haven't treated me any differently.
Yeah.
So,
how long had you been on the department before making that transition?
I believe I was on the department for about 2.5 years before I started doing the transition.
So there must have been certain things. For example, I feel like so often this conversation around trans people has to do with the bathrooms and the locker room. That just is an area where a lot of people don't know exactly how to feel. What was that like for you in your experience?
I didn't start using the men's restroom until I felt comfortable with myself. And as far as transitioning, it's mental, it's physical, but it's also emotional. And so in order to go into the men's bathroom, I needed to feel good about myself and feel like I could, pull it off. And so once I got to that point after I had top surgery, I felt, and I was on hormones for about 3 years, I felt like I'm in a good place now.
Yeah.
And I feel comfortable doing this.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I was able to talk to my supervisors, and they made it so it was a pretty clean transition.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind my asking, what was that first day like? Where you're like, okay, I'm going to be using the men's restroom, and I'm going to be using the locker room. And as you said, like, you felt like you owned it, that it was time. What did that feel like for you?
You kind of had to prepare yourself mentally, like, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to make this happen, and you have to understand that maybe anything could happen when you're in there. You could get negative comments, you could get jeers, you could get weird looks, you could get, side talk, but I'm so grateful that I was able to do that, and I didn't have any negative feedback from partners, so very thankful for that.
And we've been talking mostly about your experiences within the department. What has it been like being a trans person who is a sheriff's deputy, being out there in the public and interacting with Angelenos every day?
I feel like a lot of people just see the uniform. They don't know anything about my background, so they just take me at face value of where I'm at this place in my life. But as far as the transition in uniform out on patrol, it was quite comical sometimes, because people would go from saying ma'am to sir all in the same conversation, and I would just let them settle on one and would go from there. Yeah, it was quite a journey.
Yeah. But there are plenty of transgender people within LA as well. Has there ever been a situation where maybe you're interacting with someone who might not feel comfortable with law enforcement, but then they see, oh, okay, maybe there's someone here who might be able to understand my personal background?
Right. There's been many people that are transgender, and maybe my partner might not notice it right away, but I notice it because of my experiences.
Yeah.
And so I'm able to say, hey, what's your pronoun? And then all of a sudden it's like they kind of, what's going on? And then they open up, and I'm able to conversate with them on a different level, and I'm able to get information from them and serve them in the best way possible. So
yeah,
it's good.
As I mentioned earlier, Austin, we hear a lot about the LA Sheriff's Department as being this very masculine place, and we read news stories about potential cliques and whatnot. I'm very curious, how do you think it might have gone had your transition been from being a man to a woman? Do you think it would have been any different at all?
I would like to think it wouldn't, but I can't be sure. I know that the first person to come out as trans in the department was actually a male to female, and it wasn't an easy road for her.
Yeah.
But this was prior to having this policy in place that we have that doesn't allow for any of the negativity. That she had to deal with at that time. So,
yeah. And as you mentioned, there's this policy in place. There is an entire program there. This is the first in the nation to adopt a comprehensive policy for the protection and support of transgender employee. And my understanding is that now they're using this as a model for agencies all across the country. If, let's say, there was a sheriff somewhere out there that called you up today and said, Deputy, what can we do to make this the best experience possible? What advice would you give?
I would say treat everybody like a person, and think compassionately, think outside the box. The fact that it's just doing the right thing, having this policy in place for not only the employees that work inside the department, but also people that we work with out on the streets. It cuts down on civil liability, financial, maybe things that from the public that we don't treat them in a certain way, and then we get sued. So having this policy in place just sets a line in the sand that this is not going to be tolerated, and these are the things we expect from our employees on how to treat the public and how to treat other people within the department. And so it's just, on top of it just being the right thing to do, it's a great monetary thing for all departments.
It's cheaper. It's cheaper to be a decent human being.
Absolutely. It's cheaper to be a decent human being. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Deputy, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and for sharing your story with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
When we return, we'll meet one of the stars of the FX show Pose and hear how she is giving back to other women living in Southern California. That story just ahead. Making it in Hollywood is hard for almost all aspiring actors, regardless of gender, but being transgender can definitely add to those challenges. That's something actress Hailie Sahar knows all too well. From scripts where trans women were only portrayed as prostitutes or escorts, to finding an agent who wanted to represent her without taking advantage, Sahar had a rough time of it for years. But things are on the up and up for her now, and she's making the time to give back to others. Spectrum News 1's Bianca Ray has more.
As Hailie Sahar freshens up her lipstick, she knows beauty is only skin deep.
We all wear a mask.
And when it comes to true peace and happiness, well, that's something mascara and lipstick can't touch.
I think a lot of people have a misconception that when you're beautiful, that everything's okay. I think a lot of times people even hide behind makeup.
That's how her world started. Hailie went to performing arts school in LA as a child for dancing, which turned into a love of acting and practicing lines like she's doing right here. All the while, though, she was waiting for her moment to break free.
I've always known who I was. It is the world that told me I was different.
When she was around 18, she transitioned, and as her career took off, she never looked back.
Mother, what do we take? Everything.
The category is...
Her big break came with her role in the FX show Pose, which was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best TV Series this year. A second season is set to premiere as well.
It's the first time this has been done in history. You know, there's 5 leading trans women, and, you know, there's trans writers and directors.
A role that lets her be an actress and an activist.
I've never said this to anyone, really, but my mother, is that I've had a very rough road being aesthetically what people deem as pretty, because a lot of people either tried to harm me for that. I made a lot of people uncomfortable.
And so she started volunteering with the East LA Women's Center. Simply put, it's a center that helps women who have been so beaten down physically or even emotionally.
I think abuse is abuse. I think any form of abuse you've been through, any form of discrimination, it's not good.
Now she's one of their ambassadors, helping the group with all they do, from crisis intervention services to leadership groups like this one, getting women back on their feet after domestic violence. The center also goes out into LA communities, offering up these safety and prevention gift bags to women in need.
I understand why now that I was given the gift of art, and I also understand why I was given the struggle that I was given.
Now Hailie wears makeup with confidence, no longer using it to cover up, but rather to showcase and even flaunt who she is inside. Her words of wisdom?
Seek help. There are beautiful people in this world. As dark as the world may seem sometimes, there are beautiful people that want to help you.
And knowing some people out there unsure of who they are might watch her show and feel empowered.
It's a blessing.
And feeling beautiful in your skin, that's true inner beauty.
Our thanks to Bianca Ray for that story. We would love to hear from you on this subject. Are you transgender, or do you work with someone who is? What do you think can and should be done to make Southern California a more hospitable place to those who might not fit into traditional gender roles? Send us your thoughts. You'll find us on Twitter at IssuesOn1. I'm there as well at Alex Cohen in LA. You can also send us an email at insidetheissues@charter.com. And don't go away. When we return, we'll look at some of the issues facing trans kids and teenagers. That's coming up when Inside the Issues continues. Welcome back to Inside the Issues, where we're looking at some of the issues facing transgender Southern Californians today. According to the Williams Institute at UCLA, 27% of youth in California identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. That's the largest percentage of any state in the nation. So what are some of the issues these young people and their families face? For more on that, we're joined now by Aydin Olson-Kennedy of the Los Angeles Gender Center, and it is great to have you here. I'm going to jump right in because there's so much to talk about. I wanted to talk about the culture that we're living in, because on the one hand, I think we're Southern California, we're progressive, we're liberal, but on the other hand, we're home to such things as gender reveal parties where, if a couple is pregnant with a child, they'll have a pink cake and a blue cake, and they'll cut into it to find out what gender their baby is. How would you assess the climate on gender when it comes to our kids today?
I think that there are two things happening. I think the younger generation is moving and evolving in a way that is sort of outpacing adults. But then I think that young people are also being bogged down with many of the messages that we as adults also were bogged down with. So there's kind of a tension, if you will, between those two things. And when I think of gender reveal parties, they're sort of genital reveal parties in actuality, right?
Yeah.
And when we think about them that way, it's actually more uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So we think, I have a almost 12-year-old stepdaughter, and I think about what her world is as it relates to trans kids and gender, and it's just not the same. And so in 20 years, the generation of young people, this entire conversation will be vastly different despite the discomfort of maybe the adults around them.
Yeah, but there's still difficult discussions to have because gender can be fluid a lot of the time. And I think a lot of parents might be surprised to see their kids, especially even at a young age, expressing, hey, I'm not quite sure where I fit in. So could you talk about first kind of at what age some of those discussions might be happening, we might naturally expect them to happen, and how families can best facilitate those conversations?
Sure. Trans adults started as trans kids. And we don't really think about it in that way. And that it's true that the majority of people are still coming out or presenting specifically to Medicare a little bit later, 16, and on. But there's more and more little kids as young as like 3 and 4 and 5 who have the ability to understand and experience and then acquire language and then communicate that, which is really quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that more and more in media. And so it's really narrowing the narrative that you're only trans if you know when you're 5 or 6, which is just not true or accurate. But I think that with the increased exposure in media, what's allowing parents is to say, oh, this is a thing. And I think before parents were like, I don't even know what this thing is. And so when you have information, it allows you to have a different response, and it also creates pathways for you to explore and obtain more information in ways that just wasn't happening before. With information, parents are better equipped to support their kids. And it's true that there's a lot of fluidity amongst kids, but the idea that fluidity exists within the lens of cisgender, which is sort of the way that we think about it, is like, oh, they're probably the gender they're assigned at sex at birth, but this is just an exploration. And I think we have to sort of look at this different of saying that's true for some kids, but that's absolutely not true for all kids.
Okay, and I feel like this is the $6 million question, because I just think of my own daughter. We were just talking the other day about when she used to really be into My Little Pony. And
Sure.
it was like everything for the rest of my life, I'm totally going to be into My Little Pony. And now she looks at it with such utter disdain and hates the color pink and whatever. So you could see where parents might think it's just a phase. But of course, for a child for whom it's not just a phase, that line could be devastating. So
Absolutely.
how do you know with our kids who are still figuring so much out?
Well, we don't. And we don't have to, actually. That's the beauty of this care and this work and understanding the processes that are in place. If you're talking about a 5, 6, or 7, or even a 9, 10, or 11-year-old, there's really no appropriate medical intervention until somebody is in Tanner stage of puberty, which we don't have time to go into the medical piece of this. But what that means is that there's nothing reversible that's happening up until that time. So the idea of certainty or needing certainty is actually just harming young people and ultimately harming parents as well. Somebody who's 5 or 6 and asserting a gender that is different than their assigned sex, what they really need is space that is safe and affirming and welcoming for them to explore, to figure out what does this mean and where is this going.
Yeah.
Parents, oftentimes, I work a lot with parents. Parents, oftentimes, through great will and love, get very worried about, well, what does this look like in 5 years? What does this look like in 10 years? And part of my job in the Gender Center is say, I don't know, but let's talk about what we know right now. Right now, you have a kid that's talking about this and needs this. So let's address right now.
But sometimes there are certain pivot points, especially as a child approaches puberty, where they will have to make some decisions that could actually affect the rest of their lives. So what do you do at that stage?
Well, all puberty suppression medication is completely reversible. So there's nothing that is irreversible until you start talking about cross-sex hormones or surgery, which is still a little bit later. But even the conversation about like irreversible and are you sure is through the lens that the correct starting point is cisgender. And if you are...
And can you have just a quick definition for cisgender?
Sure. So cisgender, it means that your gender identity is the same as your assigned sex. So it's, if there was such a thing as opposites of transgender, it would be cisgender.
Right.
That it's the sort of the lens or the assumption that a young person, whether they are 16 or 21, or in my case when I transitioned at 31, are making decisions that is about should I transition and take all these risks, or should I not, because what if? But that's not really how we're looking at it. The reality is like, this life that I'm living right now is not working, and so I need to do something so that it works better.
Yeah.
Right?
All right, I want to bring up, just because this is so fascinating, we can talk about this for days. We don't have too much time left, but I want to talk, for example, because it's not just about families, it's about schools, and I was having this conversation with my colleagues actually here the other day about there is a very prestigious all-girls school here in Southern California where one of the students, high school, is now identifying more as male, but it was just this head-scratcher. But okay, if it's an all-girls school, but there is a girl who's identifying as male, does she get to stay there? Does he get to stay there? What do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do?
I was really lucky to be able to work with a lot of the all-girls school here in LA and provide training. And there was a school where one of their students was the first to walk in graduation wearing a tux, and it had been a traditionally all sort of white dress kind of graduation. Here's the thing is that we have these ideas that many of these things are fixed and rigid. And when people are given permission to sort of say, like, maybe they're not so rigid and maybe we can explore things that at the heart of education and families and sort of all of these different places is that we want kids to feel loved, supported, safe, so that they can move into adulthood and flourish. And so if what a young person needs to do that is have these environments accommodate them a little bit, or change their uniform or change their pronouns, and that is going to put that person on a trajectory of success and safety, it's actually a very small sacrifice to make. As compared to, no, this is how we do this, a very rigid approach, that young person's going to suffer, which is antithetical to schools. It's antithetical to families and religious institutions. And so giving people the tools that they need to tolerate their own discomfort, whether it's individual or sort of institutional discomfort, to make the shifts. Because if we can continue to focus on, there is a young person who is in the middle of these conversations and sometimes these conflicts, and we don't want to shoulder that young person with the burden of the discomfort of the adults.
It is such fascinating work that you do, Aydin Olson-Kennedy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat about it with us. Thank you so much. Don't go away. Coming up, we will meet a trans woman whose love of the Lakers led to an event that's part sports, part culture. It's the Globe Thotters. Coming up when Inside the Issues continues. Trying to make the world a more welcoming place for trans people happens one step at a time. For example, one transgender Angelino didn't feel comfortable watching Lakers games at bars, so she and her fiancé created a space specifically for queer Lakers fans. It's called Globe Thotters. Spectrum News 1's Sarah Pila has more.
Keegan is setting up the projector for a viewing party that she's put together with her fiancé, Keegan Smeza. The pair are the co-creators behind Globe Thotters, an event that combines playing the Lakers game while showing performance art and comedy during halftime and commercial breaks for the queer community.
We started doing it because we just really love the Lakers and following kind of their journey now that they have LeBron.
Keegan is trans and says when she came out almost 2 years ago, she was feeling like she was losing touch with some of the hobbies that she had before. Something as simple as watching the game at a bar no longer felt like a safe space. So along with Smeza, they brainstormed ideas on how they could bring their community together where they'll feel like they belong.
As a trans woman, I'm really about kind of inserting myself into spaces where there's maybe not that much visibility for trans people.
And her intention with making the community more visible is timely, since the Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration to enforce a transgender military ban, which also hits home to Keegan because she went to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland.
I came out the day that Trump had his trans military ban announced, and that just really struck a chord with me as a former service member, being like, I need to speak up for myself and my community.
And not only are the couple a voice for those who feel marginalized, these events offer a way for the community to be together, a place to get a drink, and share their mutual love for art, pop culture, and sports.
I'm just a diehard Lakers fan. I grew up in the Kobe years, so it was like a perfect match made in heaven for us as artists and LGBT community members.
And if this small act of creating this space keeps attracting more people, it has the ability to change perceptions and stereotypes that might help to transform the world.
Our thanks to Sarah Pila for that story. When we return, Rex Wilde joins us once again to share his personal story of transition and what it was like to tell his mom. Don't go away. Back now with Inside the Issues, and if you were just joining us earlier in the program, we met Rex Wilde, who works with an LA-based group called Trans Can Work. Rex told us all about how employees can make a colleague in transition feel more comfortable, and it's something that Rex knows quite well, having gone through gender affirmation transition their self. Rex Wilde, you can hear I'm still working with my pronouns, Rex. You're bearing with me. Rex is here now with their mother, Reverend Lynn Francis of Laguna Beach United Methodist Church. Thank you for joining us as well. I want to hear about what Rex was like as a child.
You know, Rex was, I guess, a normal child, busy, outgoing, had a lot of friends. It always felt like Rex was almost like boxing at the wind. Like there was some kind of frustration inside, or some kind of, you could never point at what it was directed at, but there was some internal struggle, and we didn't really ever know or understand what it was.
Huh. And Rex, does that sound accurate to you? Boxing against something?
Yeah, I think so, you know, and even in my own journey of understanding myself more, is for a long time, especially as an adolescent, I would say I had a lot of confusion and a lot of anger that I didn't even necessarily have language for. Yeah. And as I've grown and been able to process that and understand it as an adult, I think it's gotten me to a place where I could see how different things probably would have been for me as a child had I been able to be out and have language to be able to even access being out at an earlier age.
Yeah. And as I understand it, a lot of that had to do even with how you would wear, what things you would wear, your appearance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting because in middle school, me and my friends would always save our lunch money, and we would go to the Savers that was right across the street from our middle school after school. And so we would
Savers, like a thrift store?
It is. Yeah. It was like a Goodwill, right? And so we would go and we would buy clothes together, and I always gravitated towards the men's pants section. Yeah. And so I ended up having like a drawer full of those baggy, colorful Dickies men's pants.
Yeah.
And I loved wearing them, and, you know, definitely dressed in clothes that my brother would wear even. I have an older brother, and, you know, it got to a point actually where my parents one day noticed this and, you know, didn't understand why I was dressing the way that I was, and actually sat me down at the dinner table one night and just said, you know, Rex, we love you, and we want to make sure that you're dressing appropriate. And for them, it was for a girl that was my age, because that's who they understood me to be at that time. And so they told me I needed to go just to buy clothes with my mom from then on, and wanted me in dresses and in really feminine clothing. And so for, you know, years and years after that, I thought that that was the way I needed to appear. And I even noticed from others getting really affirmed the more feminine I looked. People would want to talk to me. They thought I had something to say. They told me I was beautiful. And so I thought that that meant I should just be that way, regardless of the disconnect I felt within myself.
And Lynn, I feel like we should jump in and say we heard earlier that now we're living in an era where we might be having more of those conversations, but we didn't even have some of the language that we have today to have that kind of a conversation about feminine, masculine with kids. When Rex came out to you and had a more frank conversation about gender, can you walk through what that conversation was like from your perspective?
Yes. It was actually a few conversations. I think our first conversation was over the phone, and I just sort of took in what Rex was saying.
Do you remember what the words were at the time?
Yeah, I did. I think from being in the church for a long time, I was more familiar with the LGBTQ community, and had a sense that Rex might fall into that community, just wasn't quite sure where, and I was sort of waiting to hear from Rex what that was for them. And when Rex talked about being transgender over the phone, I sort of took it in, and I thought to myself, does Rex know what they're saying? Does Rex have the maturity, and is Rex old enough to grapple with this and really understand that's where Rex fallen, and for Rex to have this journey and figure it out? but I was sort of keeping an open mind. Maybe not. Maybe Rex knows, maybe Rex doesn't. So I think maybe that was my own journey of being able to take it in and learn who Rex really is and how Rex really needs to express themselves. But what happened probably within a year after that first conversation, Rex was at my house and we were talking in the hallway, and Rex said, "Mom, I'm transgender. You know what that means, right?" And that was when it sunk in. And I know I felt what I would identify now, and I know Rex saw it on my face, was a feeling of grief and compassion at the same time. I could see what Rex must be going through in life, how Rex must have struggled within as they grew up, how there would be maybe ridicule or prejudgment on the part of society. But then I also sort of had my own grieving to do. I was, I don't know that I ever felt I was losing a daughter and gaining a son per se, but I felt like who I thought Rex was in total, I was losing. But Rex has become this full person as Rex has transitioned, and we've gained so much more in our relationship and in me being able to watch who Rex is. It's really been an amazing process.
Rex, when you hear your mom talk about grief in that way, can you relate to that? Can you understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably with the grief that my mom's experienced, it's probably been in a myriad of ways. Because I think, as we learn about gender and as you have children, right, and you dawn gender on your children, for my mom to have me as someone that she thought was an oldest daughter and realize that didn't give fullness to really who I am and who my being is, I think there was probably this loss of all those things that we associate with having an oldest daughter, right? And what that means for her as a mother. And is there going to be disconnect? Is that going to change our relationship? But I think, the other part of the grieving as well is with parents who have to get to a place where they are being affirming of their transgender and non-binary or even gender non-conforming kids, there's this point where parents also, in a sense, kind of make this transition into being able to be affirming of someone's identities and are going to have to make changes in order to make sure that they are being affirming and validating. And so, I think as well, I have had my own grief that I have experienced through my transition, because there's a lot of grief that I have around not being able to express myself authentically as a child, and looking back at my childhood and knowing I wasn't able to be my full self. But I also know I didn't even have language for that. One of the things I share with people is that, I had a lot of transgender friends when I started doing my LGBTQ education. And I would have folks ask me, are you sure you're not transgender? You just really seem like you understand this on such a deep level. And my answer always to them was, well, I'm not a man, so how can I be transgender? And then several years later, I was about the age of 24, actually, when I very first heard the term non-binary for the first time. And it was like this giant light bulb went off. Like, oh my gosh, here is this term that finally defines who I know myself to be. And so, it took me again until the age of 24 to even get to a place where I heard that word for the first time. And so I do grieve those previous years of not having been able to access this really important part of myself.
Wow, what an important discovery. In addition to being non-binary, you're also a very talented musician. And in just a few minutes, you're kind enough to perform a song for us. We just have a few seconds left here, Rex, but you wrote this song for a friend of yours who is no longer with us. Can you just tell us briefly about why you wrote this particular song?
Absolutely. I wrote this song for my friend Brett, who I also call Griffin, and they actually died 2 years ago due to suicide. They were transgender. They were the first trans person I had ever met. And, with there's a pervasiveness of trans suicidality, and we see that about 40% of all trans people have attempted suicide at some point in their life. And this number raises for people of color, and it's increased for people with disabilities. And so I wrote this song in my grief for my friend, in missing them and in wishing the world had been a better place for them, because part of their struggle was not being able to move through the world authentically. And so I hope for the world to continue growing into a place where we can embrace people of all gender identities in order to make it a world where all of us belong.
I think it just might, thanks to people like the two of you, Lynn and Rex. Thank you so much. And we'll be hearing your song in just a few moments. Don't go away. As promised, we'll hear music from Rex Wilde when Inside the Issues continues. That's it for this episode of Inside the Issues. We leave you with Rex Wilde and their song, Bright Light Angel.
Tonight I'm gonna sleep with the light on. Yours went out too soon. You were just in this house yesterday. Why'd I leave you? Spinning down, you couldn't stop until the spinning stopped you. Oh, my bright light angel, I hope peace has found you.
Los Angeles. So many stars and bright lights. People from every walk of life, every neighborhood making a difference, each with an amazing story. We are here to tell them.
I'm Giselle Fernandez, and this is LA Story.